Chair for this session is Dr. Aparna Balachandran. I invite Irandati Pal as the first speaker. Her topic is British Colonial Epistemic and Ethnographic projects in Tibet and their contestations by Indian and Tibetan writers.
So, the aim of this paper is to trace the British colonial interest in Tibet as it unfolded in three different processes across 3 centuries, beginning with the epistemological anxieties and the collection of indigenous textual archaeological materials by the Asiatic Society of Bengal and its towering Orientalists with the Sanskritists, and also with the demarcation of lines and boundaries under the great Trigonometrical Society of India, whose surveyors broadened the horizons of the territorial space of India through the epistemic and cartographic collection of grey and completely dark areas. In line with Mary Pratt's argument of how a scientific explorer in the 18th and 19th century took on the aura of innocence, but at the same time this innocence was imbricated with what was an insidious element of commercializing and colonializing. We can see that in the British context also, like for instance, before any kind of expedition or any kind of colonial conquest happened anywhere, whether in Asia or in Africa or in the space of the Latin Americas, it was preceded and followed by these thorough investigations of the nature of the culture of that place, from where they could cull the various kind of material natural resources of that places, as well as the cultural heritage of that places, so that beforehand they had a blueprint about how that place was, and after it they would conquer it. So that's how, conflicts in Boer War were also preceded before that by explorers like David Mungo and others who went out there to explore, and then their writings formed a part of they showed the kind of picture that which the British want to see, and then how they could exploit the resources of that places. So in the context of Tibet as well, we see that first they had to try to know what was Tibet, because the knowledge of Tibet around the 18th, 19th centuries, when the Asiatic Society of Bengal first started with this endeavor, they had nothing more. There were just a few missionaries before that, but then their writings weren't very complete, they were very incoherent, and some of them, such as for instance Ippolito Desideri's works, were not published in English till the late 20th century. So they had no other sources. So at this time, what the Asiatic Society of Bengal did was that they were looking at, apart from just poring over subjects like zoology, geography and botany, they were also looking at subjects like history, religious and secular literature of the Indian languages, but then they had no one around that time to study the Tibetan languages as well as the Tibetan cultures. And it was William Moorcroft, who went to Ladakh in 1825, who went out there in order to search for horses. So he was a equestrian officer in the Bengal army, and he had to look for horses out there. But apart from just looking for horses, he was the one person who almost 100 years before the young husband expedition presaged the importance of a northern buffer state against Russia. So he was the one who actually thought of these plans, but obviously he was regarded as a maverick within the British colonial official circles, and his writings, his letters were usually they weren't really listened to by the senior officials. But with these thoughts in mind, he went to Ladakh, to Srinagar, with the prospect of engaging with Ranjit Singh, with the prospect of engaging with the Dogra kings of Srinagar. At the same time, when he went out there, he met one person by the name of Alexander Körös, who came from Hungary. Now this person, in the early 19th century, Hungary was under the rule of Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs, and at that time, after the French and the American revolutions, they were also spurred by these thoughts of nationalist revival, as well as getting away from the Habsburg Empire. And combined with that, considering that he was from a place called Transylvania, which had always been very separate from, while it was under the Ottoman rule, it remained its distinct identity. And when it came under the Habsburgs as well, it maintained its distinct identity, which was explained through the secular myths. The secular myths said that there were the original Magyars who were the descendants of the Huns, the Attila the Hun, who came from Central Asia. And it was around this time that this whole issue, this whole idea of coming from Central Asia took a very, very deep effect on the Hungarian people and the Hungarian intellectual class. You had the Hungarian intellectuals like geographers like Ferenc Benko, István Kaszvo, as well as Adam Herupy, who was one of Körös's foremost and favorite teachers, who was the one to formulate this theory of how the Magyars or the Huns actually came. They were hounded by the Chinese in 3rd to the 5th centuries, and they were sent to the region around Volga, and then they settled out there, and that's how they came to live out there. And it was with these thoughts in mind that he thought that he would go to Central Asia in order to search for his ancestors. They thought that, even around that time, in somewhere around the Oasis of Central Asia, maybe around Yarkand, they would find, the people who spoke the same Hungarian languages, that they would have the same cultures. So with these thoughts in mind, he came to India. But what happened is, in between, he faced a lot of shortage of money, and at the same time he met Moorcroft. So Moorcroft knew that this person knew a lot of language. He was a polyglot. He knew more than 14 languages. He could speak in that. So, and then he told him that why don't you even go and start learning Tibetan? It would be of great help to us, and you would also receive the funds as well as the passport, which would be issued by British India in order to let you go beyond the frontiers of British India. So he took up these ideas, he took up the challenge, and then he went to Ladakh, and then he stayed for 6 years in Zaskar as well as in Pugdal. But it was all arranged by Moorcroft. You can see the kind of manipulations of Moorcroft, who was able to decide how, where and how he should study. So he engaged a person, a Sangye Phuntsok. He was a Tibetan scholar living in Ladakh, but at the same time he was the husband of the late widow of the king of Zaskar. And by sending Körös to Sangye Phuntsok, he was trying to show that the British India would protect these small territories outside their control from the Dogras, because they were afraid that any moment the Dogras would invade the kingdom of Ladakh and Zaskar. So with these thoughts in mind, he gave an assurance. At the same time, he tried to ensure that by putting Körös in a very remote location, that he would be spared from any kind of further violence if anything happened in the future. So with these thoughts in mind, he sent him out there. But what Körös did was that he first started the study of Tibetan language, and then he studied for 6 years, holed up in one single room, and with that, and with his teachers Sangye Phuntsok as well as Sultrim and another person, what he did was that they made a whole collection which in Tibetan is now known as the Alexander books, and they are famous in their own right, because what he did was, whatever the canons of Tibetan Buddhist literature, the Kangyur and the Tengyur, they studied it entirely, and they consist of more than 107 to 108 volumes, and they studied it entirely. And in those books, after studying it, he made notes, and then those notes were also very, very elaborate and very good notes, and which helped the students with the Tibetans as well as later the British government officials as well, in order to get a thorough knowledge of how Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhism was. And apart from that, he also wrote a grammar as well as a dictionary of the language itself. So with these works, he was able to ensure that the British government had a fairly good idea about the language, about the religion, as well as what he did was he studied, while he was going through the literature of Tibetan Buddhist texts as well as the secular texts, he was able to chance upon some of those texts which describe the geography of the region as well. So by using those, by studying it and by translating it and then producing it within the Journal of Asiatic Society of Bengal's volumes, what he was able to do was he was able to give a very clear, vivid picture to the British about the cosmologies as well as the mappings which the Tibetans had within their society from their cultural perspective, and these helped the British in the later stages, because before that the British hadn't thought of sending the surveyors to Tibet. They were pretty much busy within India mapping and demarcating the boundaries within India itself. So after the complete demarcation of boundaries within India, they were more interested in knowing about the frontiers, especially the Himalayan frontiers, because it wasn't controlled and the people used to move back and forth and there was no control over the population as well. So with these thoughts in mind, as well as with what Moorcroft believed would be a buffer against future Russian as well as Afghan incursions, so Körös's writings were quite helpful in that manner, because by showing the kind of maps as well as the routes which were to take, they would be very helpful. But more than that, later his writings also spurred other British officers. Like he wasn't a British officer, he was a Hungarian. So whatever he wrote, there was almost just as the British wouldn't give agency, or what I would call, they would efface the identity of the people, of the local people, the knowledges, their identities would be effaced. For instance, they would be taking knowledges from the Pandits and the Munshis, but then the names are lost. Like apart from a few who would give the names, for instance, like Brian Hodgson, who would mention that his close collaborator, Newar collaborator named Amritananda was there. But most of the time, their identities as well as the efforts that they went into making the whole Indian knowledges legible to them, they weren't present out there. So the presence was like effaced from the whole project. So in this case also, while Alexander Körös was working, his writings, interestingly, like with in the context of a journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, we have people like H.H. Wilson, who was trying to like when he wrote his, for instance, analysis of the Kangyur, Wilson was producing over that his analysis of Kangyur. So if he wrote that this is how it is, Wilson was providing the secondary revisions or the interpretations to that, and which is quite strange, because Wilson had no knowledge of the language, Wilson had no knowledge of the literature, the religious literature or the customs, whereas Alexander Körös, staying in Ladakh, knew the customs, he had seen the practices as well as the text, so he was able to interpret it more. But then came the mediation of Wilson, who would pronounce everything, and this created a lot of rift between the two as well, including at the when Alexander Körös was in dire need of money, they didn't send him money. When he asked for Sanskrit dictionaries, he wasn't given that. But when they needed his text, when they needed to explore the regions beyond Bhutan as well as beyond Kuch Bihar, that time they were very interested, and then they asked him, give us you send us your project, and we'll supply you with a monthly income of 50 rupees. And then he just refused. He's like, I don't want it. He was very, very hurt at that point of time, and this is what makes us, and this refusal of Körös actually hurt, not just hurt, but it hit the ego of Wilson. Wilson, as you all know, like he was one of the great, he was considered one of the big Orientalists of that time, the Sanskritists. But then what comes out in these exchanges between Körös and Wilson is that it comes out that a very egoistical man who in order to show his ego as well as his superiority over what he would call as the Hungarian scholar, he would decide what would be printed in the journals volumes, and he was the one to he took this grammar as well as the dictionary, and he kept it with himself. Körös wanted it to be published as soon as possible in Calcutta when he came to Calcutta in 1830s, because after giving it to the British government, he wanted to proceed on his original journey. But then he wasn't allowed to. He was forced to stay in the Asiatic Society of Bengal as a librarian, as a cataloger, during which he did lots of work as well. But then what he did was he hid his dictionary and his grammar, and he didn't publish it. And it was only later, when Wilson was about to leave India, that James Prinsep intervened and said that you go and get it printed, we need it very much, the administration needs it, the government needs it, and that's how it got printed. And along with Körös, we had others, like, as I said, Alexander Cunningham as well as Alan Campbell, but they weren't Tibetologists as such, but then they were the ones who were demarcating boundaries between India as well as Tibet. For instance, like, Cunningham went to Ladakh and to the western zone, and he tried to demarcate the western boundaries within India and Tibet, whereas Alan Campbell, he went to the eastern frontier, especially the regions around Sikkim as well as Darjeeling, and then he put his tour diaries in the journals of the Asiatic Society, through which the government could understand how far to proceed into Tibet, and how far they could understand what was previously the blank space of Tibet. And after Alexander de Körös, there was this almost some 40-50 years gap, during which there were no producers of epistemologies of Tibet. There were only the surveyors who were trained by the GTS, or the Great Trigonometrical Society Survey of India, which sent its surveys such as Nain Singh, Kishan Singh, then Ugen Gatso, Kinthup, and others. And in that period, like in the late 19th century, we have another person known as Sarat Chandra Das, who also went out there and he did his work. But in Sarat Chandra Das's case, what you find is that apart from just contributing to the journals, the Asiatic Society's journals, with his study of the religious as... Okay, there was so much more to say. Yes, so, yes, then I'll sum it up. So, in Sarat Chandra Das's case, what we find is that apart from just providing with the literature of Tibet, he was also trying to portray a kind of a proto-nationalism within itself. So, for instance, like when he was talking about the Tibetans, when he was providing an ethnography of the Tibetans, there's almost this Dickensian form of, showing how the Tibetans, the poor Tibetans, the Ragabyas, the beggars were treated. And there's this immense sympathy and understanding towards them, and it might have been partly because he was traveling with them, along with the local people dressed like them, and it may have been because of that. But at the same time, we should not forget that it was also because of his colonized status, which enabled him to see things from a different perspective than what the British did. Because when you compare the writings of others, such as, like, for instance, you have Lawrence Waddell as well as Sir Charles Bell, who are the doyens of Tibetan studies around that time in the late 19th centuries and in the early 20th centuries. Especially in the case of Lawrence Waddell, we find that there's this almost prejudicial tone which comes out every time. So apart from the influence of the ideologies of the Raj, where there were the creation of differences within India as through racial differences, as well as ordering of those differences. For instance, like when you look at, they would say that India and Britishers, the Europe, was connected by a past. There was this bridge which connected the Indian past to the European future, but then they wouldn't give Indians, or for that matter Tibetans, the chance to be equal with the British themselves, because there was this whole idea which came into being. Like, for instance, when you talk about Ronald Innan's study of like when he uses Freud's interpretation of condensation and displacement as well as secondary revisions, we find that most of the time the British writers who are making interpretations of Indian rituals as well as Indian texts, they would provide their secondary interpretations, and they would say that in India there was this almost a dreamlike, this quixotic kind of mind which did not allow them to see the natural things. So for instance, when they said that they tried to correlate the knowledge of the natural world with the kind of mental faculties which the people had. So by saying that because they weren't really engaged with nature, they didn't know much about nature, that's why they were in the lower scale of civilization. But that becomes very contradictory when it comes to the Tibetans or for the frontier peoples, because these were the peoples who were in constant touch with the nature. For instance, when Waddell says that the Lepchas and the Nepalis, they are very effeminate when it comes to going for the expedition in Tibet, then it becomes very ironical, because these were the persons who actually helped the explorers such as Joseph Dalton Hooker to actually go to those places and then study those flora and fauna of those areas. And when he says that, it becomes very laughable, but at the same time it was part of the whole imperial narrative about gazing, about creating differences, as well as feminizing not just the landscape but as the peoples as well. So in that context, when we look at Waddell's writings, there's this constant feminizing of the spaces and using John Ruskin's theories about light and shade, which he used to explain, like Turner's paintings, as well as the poetry of Shelley and Wordsworth and Keats. They were using these poetry, these influences from the cultural world, as well as the theories of evolution. For instance, you had these evolutionary theories which were propounded by Lubbock, Edward Tyler, and others who were trying to, like, while they were saying that they had the influence from the Darwinian principle of like social Darwinism, but then not exactly. They weren't imputing a biological differences. This is the late 19th century and early 20th. So while they were talking about creating a difference, the difference was based on cultures, what they called as remnants of the previous cultures. And even Tyler himself wrote 2 volumes known as like Primitive Ethnologies, where they were trying to create these differences in the various cultures and civilizations of the world through their material culture as well as the spiritual beliefs, by saying that these people were, what Anne McClintock would call as anachronistic space and panopticon time. They were using this these very ideas around that time in order to
Never stop for 2 hours.
Grand closing statement.
So I would say that, like, with evolutionary theories, as well as theories from paintings, as well as theories from poetries, they were trying to create this whole image of Tibet as a mythical land, as a sacred space where they could invade, but at the same time the space which had to be protected at all costs and protected from being a tourist space which would be invaded by other Europeans. It was a space meant exclusively for them, and it would be possessed both through material looting as well as through through the kind of writings which they were producing at that time. And in contrast to that, like, and as a challenge to that kind of writings, instead of just going to the Indian right, I think I'll move on to the Tibetan right.
I think we can't move on. I can stop here in the discussion.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.